The courtroom was a cavern of polished wood and stern faces, its high ceilings amplifying every whisper into a proclamation. At the center of it all stood Ethan Caldwell, barely 19, his lanky frame draped in a thrift-store suit that hung off his shoulders like a hand-me-down from a giant. His dark hair was a mess, as if he'd raked his fingers through it one too many times, and his sneakers, scuffed and faded, squeaked faintly on the waxed floor. To the onlookers, he was an anomaly, a kid who'd wandered into the wrong room, about to be chewed up by the machinery of justice. Judge Harlan Voss presided from his elevated bench, his jowls quivering as he leaned forward, peering over his glasses at Ethan. The judge was a man of considerable girth and even greater ego, his robe straining against his barrel chest. His reputation in Willow Creek's circuit court was ironclad, decades of rulings, sharp-tongued rebukes, and an unyielding disdain for anything that disrupted his carefully curated order. Today, that disruption was Ethan, who'd somehow landed himself as the defendant's counsel in a contentious homeowners association dispute. The case was a classic HOA power grab, the Willow Creek Homeowners Association versus Margaret Hensley, a 70-year-old widow who dared to paint her mailbox a shade of lavender deemed unacceptable by the HOA's bylaws. The HOA, led by the indomitable Patricia Langley, was seeking fines, legal fees, and an injunction to force Margaret to repaint the mailbox or face foreclosure. It was the kind of petty tyranny that thrived in suburban enclaves like Willow Creek, where conformity was king and dissent was a cardinal sin. Ethan stood at the defense table, his client Margaret seated beside him, her frail hands clutching a handkerchief. The courtroom was packed. Neighbors, HOA board members, and curious locals who'd heard about the teen lawyer and come for the spectacle. Patricia, a woman with a perm as rigid as her worldview, sat in the plaintiff's chair, her lips pursed in a smug line. Her attorney, Gregory Hammond, was a sleek, silver-haired veteran who'd made a career out of crushing small-time defendants. He adjusted his cufflinks, barely concealing his amusement at the boy across from him. "Mr. Caldwell," Judge Voss began, his voice dripping with condescension, "do you even understand the gravity of this proceeding? Or did you stumble in here thinking this was a high school debate club?" A ripple of laughter spread through the courtroom. Ethan's cheeks flushed, but he straightened, meeting the judge's gaze. "Your Honor, I'm here to represent Mrs. Hensley, and I assure you, I'm prepared." "Prepared?" Voss barked, leaning back in his chair. "You look like you're prepared to mow my lawn, not argue a case. Have you even passed the bar, son?" More laughter. Patricia's smirk widened, and Hammond coughed politely into his fist, feigning professionalism. Margaret reached for Ethan's hand under the table, giving it a reassuring squeeze. She'd known Ethan since he was a boy, delivering newspapers on his bike, always stopping to chat with her about her garden. When the HOA came after her, and no lawyer in town would touch the case for her meager savings, Ethan had stepped up. She didn't know how he'd managed it, but she trusted him. "I'm admitted to practice, Your Honor," Ethan said evenly, producing a folded document from his jacket pocket. "Pro hac vice, approved by the state bar for this case." Voss snatched the paper from the bailiff, scanning it with a scowl. It was legitimate, though it baffled him. A teenager, barely out of high school, admitted to argue in his courtroom. He tossed the paper aside. "Fine, let's see how quickly you drown. Proceed with your opening statement if you even know what that is." Ethan cleared his throat, stepping forward. His voice was steady, though it carried the faint tremor of youth. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case isn't about a mailbox. It's about freedom. It's about a widow who's lived in her home for 40 years, who's raised her children there, who's buried her husband, and who now faces the threat of losing everything because a group of busybodies decided her mailbox is the wrong shade of purple. The Willow Creek HOA has overstepped its authority, weaponizing vague bylaws to harass and intimidate. We'll show that their actions violate state law, their own governing documents, and basic human decency. The room fell silent. Margaret's eyes glistened, and even some of the spectators shifted uncomfortably. Hammond raised an eyebrow, caught off guard by the kid's clarity. Patricia, however, rolled her eyes, whispering something to her attorney. Voss wasn't impressed. Bold words for someone who looks like he's still learning to shave. Mr. Hammond, your turn. Hammond rose, his voice smooth as silk. Your Honor, the HOA's bylaws are crystal clear. All exterior modifications must be approved by the board. Mrs. Hensley ignored this, defying the community's standards. This isn't about freedom. It's about order, about maintaining property values for everyone. We'll prove she acted in bad faith and we seek full compliance, plus damages. The judge nodded approvingly, then turned back to Ethan. Your witness list, Mr. Caldwell, assuming you have one. Ethan handed over a single sheet of paper. Voss glanced at it, then snorted. One witness? Yourself? This ought to be entertaining. The morning wore on, with Hammond calling Patricia to the stand. She testified with rehearsed indignation, detailing the egregious Lavender mailbox, how it disrupted the aesthetic harmony of Willow Creek. She produced photos, bylaws, and a petition signed by 12 neighbors demanding action. Hammond's questioning was precise, painting Margaret as a stubborn scofflaw. When it was Ethan's turn to cross-examine, he approached Patricia with a calm that belied his age. Ms. Langley, he began, your bylaws require approval for significant exterior modifications. Can you define significant for the court? Patricia hesitated. It's anything that changes the look of a property. So, a mailbox is significant, Ethan pressed. What about a welcome mat, a potted plant? Where's the line? Hammond objected, but Voss overruled, curious despite himself. Patricia stammered, it's at the board's discretion. Discretion, Ethan repeated, holding up the bylaws. Yet the bylaws don't mention mailboxes at all, do they? In fact, they only reference structures like fences or additions. Isn't that correct? Patricia's face reddened. It's implied. Implied, Ethan echoed, turning to the judge. Your Honor, if the HOA can imply rules to suit their whims, what's to stop them from finding someone for their choice of curtains? The gallery murmured. Voss banged his gavel, but his eyes narrowed, watching Ethan closely. The kid wasn't floundering, not yet. As the session broke for lunch, Ethan overheard whispers from the spectators. Who is this kid? He's got guts, but he's in over his head. Margaret patted his arm, her voice soft. You're doing fine, Ethan. Don't let them rattle you. But outside, in the courthouse hallway, Patricia cornered him. You think you're clever, boy? You're embarrassing yourself. Drop this, or we'll make sure Margaret loses more than her mailbox. Ethan met her gaze, unflinching. Threats don't change facts, Ms. Langley. See you in court. Back in the courtroom, the afternoon session began with Ethan calling his sole witness, himself. Voss scoffed, but Ethan took the stand, swearing the oath with a steadiness that quieted the room. He began by explaining his credentials, not just a high school graduate, but a prodigy who'd aced the LSAT at 16, studied law through an accelerated program, and passed the bar exam on his first try. He'd taken Margaret's case pro bono because he'd seen the HOA's bullying firsthand growing up in Willow Creek. I'm not here to grandstand, Ethan said. I'm here because the HOA's actions are legally baseless. Their bylaws don't cover mailboxes, and their fines violate state statutes on HOA overreach. I've submitted evidence, case law, state codes, and the HOA's own records, showing they've misapplied their authority. Hammond's cross-examination was brutal, attacking Ethan's age, his inexperience, his naive idealism. But Ethan parried each question, citing precedents with precision, his voice growing stronger. The gallery was riveted, and even Voss leaned forward, his mockery replaced by grudging curiosity. As the day's session ended, Ethan submitted a motion to dismiss, arguing the HOA lacked standing. Voss didn't rule, but his parting words were less venomous. We'll reconvene tomorrow. Don't get cocky, Mr. Caldwell. Outside, Margaret hugged Ethan, tears in her eyes. I knew you were special, she whispered, but Ethan's mind was already racing, knowing the HOA wouldn't back down easily. Dawn broke over Willow Creek, the kind of crisp morning that made the suburb's manicured lawns glisten. Ethan hadn't slept. He'd spent the night in his cramped apartment, surrounded by law books and takeout containers, refining his strategy. The HOA's case was flimsy, but Patricia and Hammond were relentless. They'd likely pivot to personal attacks or dig up some obscure bylaw to trap him. He had to be ready. Back in court, the atmosphere was electric. Word of Ethan's performance had spread, drawing a larger crowd. Reporters from local papers scribbled notes, and a few neighbors held signs supporting Margaret. Patricia, however, was undeterred, her glare fixed on Ethan as if she could will him to crumble. Hammond opened with a new tactic, calling an expert witness, a property appraiser who claimed the Lavender mailbox lowered neighborhood values by at least 2%. The figure was absurd, but the appraiser's credentials lent it weight. Hammond followed with a parade of HOA board members, each echoing Patricia's narrative of community standards and necessary enforcement. Ethan listened, taking notes, his expression unreadable. When it was his turn, he cross-examined the appraiser with surgical precision. "Mr. Thornton, your report cites a 2% value drop. Can you provide a single sale in Willow Creek where a mailbox color was the deciding factor?" The appraiser fumbled, admitting he'd based his estimate on general trends. Ethan pressed further, producing a study showing no correlation between mailbox colors and property values. The appraiser's credibility unraveled, and the gallery buzzed. Next, Ethan recalled Patricia, this time focusing on the HOA's finances. "Ms. Langley, your records show the HOA spent $12,000 on legal fees for this case, yet your annual budget for community maintenance, roads, parks, utilities, is only $15,000. Why prioritize this lawsuit over, say, fixing the potholes on Maple Drive?" Patricia sputtered, claiming the lawsuit protected property values. Ethan countered with HOA meeting minutes, obtained through a public records request, showing board members joking about teaching Margaret a lesson. The revelation stung, and Patricia's composure cracked. Hammond tried to recover, objecting to Ethan's theatrics, but Voss overruled, his interest piqued. Ethan then introduced a bombshell, a state statute limiting HOA fines to reasonable amounts, with case law defining reasonable as tied to actual damages. The HOA's $5,000 fine, Ethan argued, is disproportionate to a $50 mailbox. It's punitive, not corrective, and thus illegal. The courtroom was a powder keg. Spectators whispered, and Patricia's allies shifted uncomfortably. Voss, for the first time, looked at Ethan not as a child, but as a contender. During a recess, Hammond approached Ethan, his tone patronizing. "You're punching above your weight, kid. Settle now, or we'll bury you in appeals." Ethan smiled thinly. "You're welcome to try, Mr. Hammond, but I'm not the one running scared." Back in session, Ethan presented his closing argument. He wove a narrative of David-versus-Goliath, of a widow defending her home against a petty tyranny. He cited statutes, precedents, and the HOA's own contradictions, his voice ringing with conviction. "This isn't about a mailbox," he concluded. "It's about power and whether we let bullies hide behind bylaws. Mrs. Hensley deserves justice, and I ask you to deliver it." Hammond's closing was polished but predictable, leaning on community standards and contractual obligations. But the momentum had shifted. The gallery applauded Ethan, earning a sharp gavel from Voss. As the day neared its end, Voss retired to consider his ruling. Ethan and Margaret waited in the hallway, her hand trembling in his. "You've done more than I ever hoped," she said. "Whatever happens, I'm proud." Ethan nodded, but his stomach churned. He'd exposed the HOA's flaws, but Voss was unpredictable. If the judge ruled against them, the fight would drag on, draining Margaret's resources. The courtroom was standing room only as Voss returned. His face was unreadable, his voice gruff. "I've seen a lot in this courtroom, but I'll admit, Mr. Caldwell, you're a surprise. I thought you'd crash and burn. You didn't." The gallery held its breath. Voss continued. The HOA's bylaws are vague, and their enforcement here is overzealous. The plaintiff has failed to show actual harm, and their fines violate state law. I'm granting the defendant's motion to dismiss, with prejudice. A cheer erupted. Margaret clutched Ethan's arm, tears streaming down her face. Patricia's face was a mask of fury, and Hammond looked like he'd swallowed a lemon. Voss wasn't done. Furthermore, I'm awarding Mrs. Hensley's legal fees to be paid by the HOA, and Ms. Langley, I suggest your board revisits its priorities before dragging this court into another petty vendetta. The gavel fell, and the room exploded in chatter. Reporters swarmed Ethan, who deflected their questions with a shy smile. Margaret hugged him, sobbing. You saved my home, Ethan. You saved me. Outside, the sun was setting over Willow Creek, casting long shadows across the courthouse steps. Neighbors approached Ethan, some apologizing for siding with the HOA, others offering thanks. Patricia stormed past, muttering about appeals, but her allies avoided her gaze. As Ethan walked Margaret home, she pointed to her lavender mailbox, still standing defiantly. You know, she said, I think it's the prettiest one on the block. Ethan laughed. It's perfect, Mrs. Hensley. By nightfall, word of Ethan's victory had spread beyond Willow Creek. Posts on X called him the teen lawyer who took down the HOA, and local news outlets ran stories about the brilliant kid in sneakers. But for Ethan, it was never about fame. It was about a promise, to Margaret, to justice, to himself. As he sat on his apartment's fire escape staring at the stars, Ethan knew this was just the beginning. The HOA might regroup and other battles loomed, but for now, he'd won, and in Willow Creek, one lavender mailbox stood as a quiet rebellion, a testament to a kid who'd dared to fight. If you liked this story, please like, subscribe, and share it with others so they can learn something from it too.